Hello everybody and welcome to week 5 of Ethics and Accountability in Forensic Mental Health. Today's lecture is the first lecture of Module 2 and it's about capacity and consent. This lecture will be viewed by students across Australia and therefore I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands throughout Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of these lands, the elders who have passed, and elders still present today. I'd like to acknowledge the hardships suffered by these people across Australia and hope that the material this lecture is sensitive to this. So today, in this lecture, we're going to be covering the following. What is competence, capacity, and consent? In particular, we're going to look at, for capacity, what is impaired capacity, and in relation to impaired capacity, how that fits in relation to criminal responsibility and fitness for trial. And then we're going to consider informed consent, and we're going to look at the different variations of informed consent. We're going to look at the practical obstacles and discuss disclosure of information necessary for informed consent. So if we think about competence, capacity and consent, the things that we need to consider is the determination of competence requires assessment of capacity. Competence is the legal concept. Capacity is a health and legal concept. Competence is about being capable, competent, or legally fit to make decisions. Components of capacity include informed consent, concept of free choice, and reliability. Informed consent is agreement to a proposal with an understanding of what is involved with and without coercion. So let's have a look at capacity. There is a presumption in law that individuals over the age of majority, which is 18 years in most countries, are competent and responsible members of society, whereas those under this age are not. Out of interest, take some time to look at the age of majority for Iran and Saudi Arabia and the gender differences. The age of majority is the moment where we cease legally being minors or children and assume control over our persons, actions and decisions. For most countries, this is 18. Individuals with serious mental illnesses can be an exception to this assumption. Capacity and competency decisions are central to who is considered culpable for a crime and who can be compulsorily hospitalised and involuntarily treated. A range of other behaviours can be subject to restrictions due to impaired capacity. These include financial control, health decision-making, possession of a firearm, and driving. Now, Devereux in 1999 makes a distinction between capacity as a juristic concept and competency, which refers to functional abilities. Decisions regarding a client's capacity are informed by assessments of competency conducted by mental health practitioners. However, the actual decisions are either made by courts or other statutory bodies. Radin in 2002 stated that once decisional capacity criteria have been defined, they can be measured. However, these reflect underlying moral concepts such as paternalism or liberalism. If you get a chance, have a look at Parker's work from 2004. Paternalism refers to overriding the person's decisions in their own interests. Assessments of capacity attempt to balance considerations of personal autonomy against protection from harm. Koppelman in 1990 regards value-free competency and capacity assessments to be impossible and makes a distinction between justifiable and unjustifiable paternalism. Devereaux in 1999 has described competency as a gatekeeper, indicating whether autonomy or beneficence should take precedence in an individual situation. So it can be difficult as a clear majority of mental health practitioners to take on their roles out of a desire to do the best for their clients, to do good, to be beneficent. The problems here is our beneficence can lead to, intimate or interpret decisions that override the autonomy of a client or respect for a client's right to choose. So when we then think of impaired capacity and we put this with criminal responsibility, we're referring to individuals with impaired capacity who may not be completely incapacitated and impaired. Legal criteria to determine criminal responsibility usually consists of a combination of three capacities. First, the ability to know right from wrong. Second, the ability to know the nature of the action. And the last is the ability to control the action or control the behaviour. Relevant consideration is the individual's mental state at the time of the alleged offence. The second thing about impaired capacity relates to fitness for trial. This is about the ability to make a plea, understand proceedings, and communicate with legal counsel. If found unfit to stand for trial, either temporarily or permanently, they are diverted from the criminal justice system to the forensic mental health system. Requirements of fitness for trial is fundamental to the fairness and moral dignity of the trial process. Now, it must be stated that each state in Australia has a different way that they may deal with impaired capacity. In Queensland, we have a specific mental health court where individuals will be referred to have the decision-making regarding their impaired capacity. In other states, a mental health court does not exist, and this decision is made through the normal court processes or other jurisdictions. So if we're thinking about capacity in relation to informed consent, what we're referring to is a person's agreement to undergo treatment or some other procedure where the agreement is made voluntarily, not coerced, and made based on adequate information. The core idea is that because individuals are autonomous, they should be given a choice in what happens to them. It is the capacity for choice that must be respected. The components of informed consent are information, which is the potential harms and benefits of the treatments; understanding, so the ability to use non-technical language to help an individual understand the nature of the treatment; consent, is it voluntary and an unforced choice; and authorisation, the conferral of power to act from one person to another through signing a form. Now, there are variations of the concept of informed consent, such as implied consent. Implied consent refers to individuals who are able to provide consent but not asked for consent on every single occasion. So, for example, a hospital patient is not required to provide consent for routine, low-risk procedures. Then we have presumed consent. This refers to individuals who are temporarily incapacitated and unable to consent but require immediate treatment, for example, in emergency situations. So if we think of informed consent as an ethical concept, I think it's important, or the importance of informed consent lies within the values attached to it. Ethically speaking, informed consent is distinctive for a number of reasons. It is a way in which the forensic mental health practitioner signals that they respect the choice of the individual under treatment. It recognises the importance of respecting people's autonomy. Autonomy, which refers to a person's right to self-determination or right to make choices for themselves that reflect their own values. And it's a means by which the values of the individual drive the process of treatment. Of course, there are practical obstacles to this. Informed consent may be problematic for a number of practical reasons. From the perspective of the patient, difficulties in granting informed consent can include not having English as a first language, cultural and religious differences, ability to comprehend technical details, there's cognitive impairment, if there's a lack of appreciation of potential consequences, if individuals are feeling intimidated by experts and institutions, and if the person is being in a dependent situation. So from the perspective of the mental health practitioner, additional practical difficulties might include time constraints, labour intensiveness, complexity of medical and legal information, uncertainty about whether the patient understands and can comprehend what is being told to them. In forensic mental health settings, the issue of informed consent is often complex because clients sometimes lack the capacity to make a rational choice or are subjected to legislation that permits involuntary treatment. Involvement with a forensic mental health system may be regarded as coercive in that it contains elements of control and deprivations of liberties. There may also be a lack of realistic choices to offer the patient and no option for non-consent. The individual may not actually have the choice to refuse treatment or supervision or other actions aimed at reducing risk. So when we think about the information we provide clients on which they make their informed decisions to provide consent, how much information do we actually provide to clients? So there's a question of what and how much information should be disclosed to the individual requiring treatment or involved in an intervention, as well as what information may be required for another service to continue treatment. While there is no single answer, there are several principles that can be used as a guide. First principle is a precedence principle. This is the idea that the practitioner will know what and how much to disclose on the basis of previous working experience. Often the precedent is determined not only by the experience of the professional, but also by the existing practices within the professional community or institutional setting. The second principle is the principle of reasonableness. The idea here is that what and how much information should be disclosed will be decided by what a reasonable person would need to know concerning the harms and benefits of proposed treatments. Although the term reasonable may appear ambiguous, its definition has been built up by legal determinations over time. So a reasonable person is a composite of a relevant community's judgment as to how a typical member of said community should behave in situations that might pose a threat of harm through action or inaction to the public. So it is not the average or the norm, but would be how we as a society think we should behave, not necessarily how we do as a society. The last principle is the pragmatic principle. On this principle, the forensic mental health practitioner should disclose only that information which is a particular person under treatment needs to know. The question then is raised, how do we determine what they need to know? Given the centrality of consent to ethical sound practice, informed consent should always be sought, even when an individual is subject to statutory restrictions. There will be variations in the extent and nature of impaired capacity and associated competency across individuals and circumstances, but informed consent should always be sought. So some take-home points for today's mini lecture include Capacity refers to the quality of being capable, competent, or legally fit to make decisions. Informed consent is agreement to a proposal with an understanding of what is involved and without coercion. The ethical foundation of these concepts is autonomy and the right to self-determination. And individuals over the age of majority, which in Australia is 18 years of age, which is the age at which we are considered competent and responsible members of society. Exceptions to this can include people with serious mental illness. Capacity and competency are central considerations of culpability for crimes and involuntary treatment. Decisions regarding a client's capacity are informed by assessments of competency conducted by mental health practitioners, but the actual decisions are either made by courts or other statutory bodies. And a reminder that in Queensland, there is a mental health court that can make that decision. And in other states, other courts and statutory bodies. Individuals with impaired capacity may not be completely incapacitated and impaired. Legal determination of criminal responsibility involves the person having capacity to know right from wrong, know the nature of the action, and control the behaviour. Fitness for trial refers to the ability of a person's competence to undergo trial process, ability to make a plea, understand proceedings, and communicate with legal counsel, underlaid by principle of justice and fairness. Informed consent is about a person's agreement to undergo treatment or a procedure where agreement is made voluntarily and based upon adequate information. Components of informed consent are information, understanding, consent, and authorisation, and it has underlying principles of autonomy, which is an individual's right to self-direction. The level of information provided by health professionals in order to ensure clients are able to provide informed consent is based upon the principles of precedence, reasonableness, and pragmatism. So now, considering everything we've talked about in today's lecture, I'd now like you to take some time to consider the following scenario. I'd like you to have a think about what are the ethical issues and what would you do? So Joe is a middle-aged man who has a chronic psychotic illness that is characterised by a number of persecutory and grandiose delusional beliefs. In addition to this, he has developed many delusional concerns about his body and its functioning. Due to a poor response to treatment, Joe is on high levels of medication. In the course of his mental health treatment, Joe develops an acute thyroid disease. He tells the treating team that he believes they have somehow caused this disease by the medication or poisoning his food in recent months. He requires oral medication to address the thyroid disease, but Joe fears further poisoning and will not take the new medication. What ethical issues does this case raise? So I guess for me, if we think about this case, for me, Joe's mental capacity to make a decision about his medical treatment is an ethical consideration. I'd like you to think about, is he considered incompetent to make the decision on the basis of his delusional beliefs? That is, can we consider that Joe's mental state sufficiently is deteriorated that he cannot meet the demands of this decision-making situation, weighed in light of its potential consequences? I guess, what are the consequences of not taking a thyroid medication? Has he the ability to make informed consent, to refuse treatment? If so, what's the criteria for that? What about Joe's right as an autonomous agent, his right to self-determination, to make decisions about himself based upon his beliefs and values? Will we override his decision in best interest of considering beneficence over autonomy? therefore coming from the perspective of justifiable paternalism? Does he have all the information of the potential harms and benefits of treatment and refusing treatment? Or do you think he requires more information to be able to make that decision? Does he understand this information, the nature of treatment and refusal of the treatment? Is he providing his choice voluntarily? Is he correct in his understanding? What is the effect of high levels of medication? In the process of his treatment, he developed the acute thyroid disease. Additional information I'd require, given my lack of knowledge in the links between thyroid disease and psychosis or antipsychotics and acute thyroid disease, would be what are the potential reasons and are they the links? I'd really like to hear what you think. Take some time to put up your thoughts or a statement or question you have for others on this lecture on the informal discussion board thread. I think when it comes to decision making and it comes to informed consent and a person's capacity to provide informed consent, it's quite easy sometimes for us to make a decision on what we think is best for the patient instead of considering what the patient actually wants if we disagree with their decision. Sometimes a person might be quite capable and competent to make a decision, even though we may think it's the wrong choice. But just because we think it's the wrong choice does not necessarily mean the person is incompetent or incapable. It is really important that we consider the criteria on how we assess someone for informed consent and their capacity to make informed consent and make decisions. If you're ever going to be considering doing assessments on a person's capacity based on intellectual disability, I really recommend you refer to the PRESA criteria. I'm hoping that one of your other subjects will take you through these, because it's extremely important to understand the PRESA criteria, or rules that people must consider when making decisions about a person's capacity based on intellectual disability. So the recommended readings or required readings for this week are Koppelman, Callaghan and Winnick. It is a lot of information to take in, and it's a bit difficult sometimes to distinguish between the law and health readings. There's also a paper recommended by, just a recommended reading, which speaks specifically for fitness for trial in Queensland, referring to the mental health court process. So that can be useful for people who work within Queensland and within the realm of decision making regarding capacity for fitness for trial, and it might be useful, I think, for people living in other states and territories to look at to see how the decision makings or how the court process works within Queensland. So thank you. If you have any questions, please place them up on the student questions thread found in the student chat forum on the board, or email us directly.